Pressing live. And we're live.
All right, welcome folks. We are the Outcomes Measures Work Group, Part 2. It feels like it's been a year since we have all gathered in the same room, but I believe it's only been 3 months. But thank you all for joining us again. I want to just quickly review what we're going to talk about today, our agenda. The first thing after we reintroduce ourselves is Dr. Ivory Toldson will be giving us his report on prioritizing equity at the forefront of outcome measures. And then Emma and I are going to just sort of remind us what we did and what we're about to do. So before we jump into Dr. Tolson's presentation, I just want to reintroduce sort of who we are, group membership. So I'm chairing this committee with my co-chair partner in crime, Joe Manco, who's also a member of the AIB. We have 9 appointed members and 13 ex officio members, and I would love for you all to not introduce yourselves because we don't have time, but if you could type in the chat your name, remind people like what you do, what your title is, or what you do, and for whom you work for. That's both the 9 appointed members and the 13 ex officio. That would be really helpful for folks to be able to look up the chat and remind themselves, who is this Emily Dow? So just post that in the chat, and then we will have a new incoming student member, but we're still working out the details with that person. So hopefully we'll be joining us soon. And as this chat is rolling by, I think we are ready to hear from Dr. Toldson. Emma, is there anything I should have mentioned?
Nope, I think we're good. So Dr. Toldson, you should be able to share your screen, but I'm going to stop sharing now so you can do that. Let me know if you have any trouble.
It's saying that participants sharing is disabled.
Ah, all right. Hold on. Okay. You know what? We do need to make you, I thought that you had been made a co-host, and we just need someone to make you a co-host. And Shawanda stepped away for just a second, but as soon as she comes back, we'll give you co-host ability so you can share your screen.
Okay. If you want me to begin.
Yeah, if that works for you, if you don't mind, I'm sorry about that, but tech difficulties, that's always there. Always there. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. Well, I want to first thank you, Emma, for the accommodations you've made for me to start early so that I can make it to another panel. But more importantly, all of the detailed feedback and helping to clarify certain aspects of this process, and all of your contributions really made this process go a lot better. And I think that's reflected in the report. I know that Dr. McClendon is also here, so Dr. McClendon helped out tremendously in terms of helping to work through the recommendations and observations. You all hear me okay? I think there's some background noise. Okay. So I guess I hear and not you all, so that's good. I'll try not to be distracted by it. So the report that you all will receive shortly after this meeting, it's about a 30-page report called Prioritizing Equity at the Forefront of Outcomes Measures. And the report does what we were initially charged to do, to look at all the outcome measures and to determine whether or not there was potential to leverage the outcome measure to improve equity, or if there was some risk posed by any of the outcome measures that, if not adequately addressed, there may have been a potential for some of the outcome measures to work against our best efforts to achieve equitable and inclusive learning environment. So the report that you'll receive will have our theoretical framing and the approach that we took to the work. It'll have an overview. And one of the things that we did was we looked at all of the different outcome measures and legislative requirements and data to be collected and we looked to see whether or not it was a measure that we thought had a high potential to advance equity. And where we saw that, we indicated it by green. And we also looked at measures that we thought had a high risk of impeding equity without considerable safeguards in place. We also acknowledge in the report that the measures that we're looking at now do reflect a lot of the conversations that we've had throughout this process. So there were measures that were introduced to us. We had some critiques, and a lot of the critiques were in line with some of the people in this working group. And there was some improvement and some compromises in some cases that led to a set of measures that will be reflected in this report that we believe are much improved from what was presented initially. However, there are some things that we observe later on in the process that we think needs to be considered, at least considered. And there may have been, some compromises that we made, and we wanted to reiterate or restate some of the things that we said through this process that we felt like, maybe didn't fully get captured in the final report.
You should be able to share your screen now. Just wanted to let you know.
Good, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, you all see my screen?
Yes, it's narrow just because it's a Word doc. I don't know if it's possible to zoom out a little bit just to see more of the document. There you go. Okay, that's great.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we went through the blueprint level outcomes, and we also looked at each pillar. There's 5 pillars there, and you all know all of that. With the blueprint level outcomes, there were quite a few, and these blueprint level outcomes were the overarching outcomes that we were looking at. A lot of the blueprint level outcomes are addressed later in the report, so I didn't really go into a lot of detail in terms of determining whether or not there was an equity consideration or equity potential. But on here, you'll see the concerns with the KRA. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The one related to achievement gaps, I put the red and the green on there. The reason why I put the red is because of some considerations we should take when we are discussing the achievement gap. But I put the green on there because I know that it's coming from the right motivation. And then also through the process, we talked about that importance of looking at within group, doing that within group analysis, which I think is the best way to learn what works or what we should be doing, as opposed to just looking at problems. Others that have green, and most of the other things I talk about in more detail. So with are in other pillars, but with the blueprint level, the only thing I didn't really get a chance to address in the other pillars was possible equity issues with using the achievement gap. So I just reiterated some of the things that I talked about in terms of sometimes the validity of the achievement gap is questionable because a lot of times it uses unfair comparisons. It'll compare someone in one situation to someone in another situation, which is fine if you're trying to identify problems with the situation, but too often we use it to identify problems with the person, as if the person should have certain outcomes despite the situation that they're in. Also, sometimes the achievement gap analyses can lead to unfair negative stereotypes and myths about certain groups. It captures deficits and weaknesses while ignoring a lot of assets and potential that they might have. And I also have discussed in a lot of my prior work that a within group analysis, if we want to understand how children in a tough learning environment can navigate that environment, we don't compare them to students in an environment that has all these resources, we look within that environment, we look at the highest functioning students in that environment, and you find what are some of the nuances, differences in their situation so that you could try to scale that out. And I acknowledge that that is within the wording of the outcome measures. So in terms of Pillar 1, early childhood education, we looked at the various legislative requirements. There were some considerations that we noted as we did the research and observations about Maryland Excel's program, as well as the kindergarten readiness assessment, which I know we had some very robust conversations about. I think that there were some, there's language in here regarding training on the kindergarten readiness assessment to mitigate some of those concerns that we discussed. One of the things that I noted in my recommendations is that the trainings need to specifically address rater bias, because trainings just on the administration of the test itself, I don't think would really address some of these biases that may happen when observers or when teacher raters are looking across cultures and different cultural contexts. Also talking here about, and this is something that we discussed during the meetings, we should make sure that the kindergarten readiness assessment isn't juxtaposed to kindergarten readiness overall. Kindergarten readiness is a theoretical construct. The assessment aims to look at that. But when we are saying, when we're using the score and saying, you're ready for kindergarten and you're not, just based on that score, it goes against classical test theory. It goes against the idea that a number, a score, is always something that is an estimate, and we don't really know the true score and the amount of error. And error can come from rater bias, it can come from testing conditions, it can come from cultural differences. So we need to make sure that the public understands that that just because you're low on the assessment doesn't mean you are not ready for kindergarten, that you can be low on the assessment, still ready for kindergarten, and vice versa. Another recommendation we have is we don't think that it's a good idea to publish this data. Now, this may sound contrary to some of the other things that I've talked about in terms of democratizing the data, but democratizing the data means that you bring data that people can use, you discuss it publicly, and you use it in a responsible way. And it's data that's presented in a way that is useful to everyone. Because of some of the questions with the kindergarten readiness assessment, and because it almost consistently always shows a gap between races and shows white students on top. Most of the time when I've seen the kindergarten readiness assessment by race, white students are even above Asian students, even though that flips later in their academic journey. So we don't think that publishing it will really serve the objectives that we want. There's also some issues that we identified through the literature with Maryland Excels. I don't have a whole lot of direct knowledge or contact with Maryland Excels. Is more what I've learned through research for this report. But there's some considerations that we should think about, and this has been published in a few sources, and I list the references right here. And I do have some recommendations on here related to really reviewing the standards, making sure that they're culturally and linguistically responsible, financial incentives for providers, technical assistance and training, and different things like that. Pillar 2, high quality and diverse teachers and leaders. There's a lot of potential for to advance equity through a lot of the programs that are being proposed in the legislation and also in the outcomes. There were some questions related to national board certification of teachers. And incidentally, I was on the panel at the White House today, and I was sitting next to the director of the, her name is Peggy, what's her last name? Peggy?
Brookins.
Yes.
Peggy
yes.
Brookins. Great.
Right, yeah, so I got a chance to meet her today. And
Excellent.
and I mentioned to her that Dr. Kerwin said that we should meet. But some of the cautionary notes that I put in the recommendations is there's been some longstanding concerns about equity issues in national teacher certification. Some of those specifically, those who are certified are more likely to teach in higher resource schools. They're more likely to be white. They're more likely to teach science. They're more likely to be women. And so we want to diversify the teacher workforce. But if we are trying to, or we want to have more diverse teachers in priority schools. But if we are looking to increase the number of national board certification teachers without diversifying the actual group of teachers who are certified, then one aim could work against the other. We also had a question in our last, we also had a discussion in our last meeting regarding, do we have the evidence, is the evidence available that high priority schools would benefit from national board certified teachers? And so I just wanted us to think a little bit more carefully about that and critically about it, and really understand what these schools need beyond this one measure, and whether or not the process of getting certification really does help you to become better equipped to deal with some of the students that need a whole lot more. So those are the conversations that we had related to that. And so these are some of the documented issues with national board certification. Some of the other recommendations that we included in this, there's a recommendation to measure the number of hours that teachers spend in professional development to learn how to competently teach across culture. There are measures in here about professional development, but none of them specifically speak to the number of hours they spend specifically looking at cultural issues and how to teach across culture. And we think that that's very, very important. There's also recommendations on measuring the impact of teachers using technology. Just understanding the times that we're in right now, technology is really influencing the teacher workforce and education in general. I think that if this blueprint is going to be, the blueprint of the future, then we have to understand that there's the way that teachers use technology can help them to reach students that they may not have been able to reach a couple of decades ago. We also have to understand that technology has the potential to reprioritize what we consider to be a good teacher. In the way that we train our teachers, the way that we certify our teachers, and the way that we rate our teachers' competence, a lot of it has to do with their ability to retain information, their ability to be more like computers. But as computers have more of a presence in our classrooms, then we could put some of the heavy cognitive lifting on computers, and we can maybe reprioritize things like compassion, empathy, and cultural competence. We think that teachers using things like virtual augmented reality, artificial intelligence, machine learning, social media platforms, different things like that can create different opportunities to help students to learn differently. There's an article that I wrote about this, Humanistic Distributed Agency, Remaking Education at the Human Technology Frontier, that I include in here that talks a little bit more in detail about what I just discussed. And that's all I want to say about teachers at this point. And I'm going to fly through this. I should be finished talking by 2:30, and then we can open up for questions. So pillar 3, college and career readiness. So most of what we found in here, we believe has a lot of potential. There's some, long-standing, or not long-standing, but there are some persistent questions that we had about the college and career readiness standards. We do understand that there's some revisions that's happening to the standards right now, or there is a task force that are looking at the standards a lot more closely. And perhaps some of the concerns that we have will be addressed in those standards. But the overarching concern is just overall use of standardized testing to measure proficiency in language mathematics, trying to understand or just making sure that we understand that there are many different ways to understand whether or not someone is college and career readiness, and a holistic approach is the best approach. There are a lot of ways to address that in the current standards, though. So the fact that we have something that's addressing standardized tests, or to be addressed by standardized tests, it certainly doesn't negate the fact that there are other outcome measures in there that looks at more holistic aspects of the student's development. Have some considerations in using the standardized test. Sometimes testing can be useful. So some of the principles I put in here, and a lot of this comes from my book, No BS. So democratizing the data, data literacy, no bad stats, and you all might see the comment on there that Rachel loves it. And then high impact data. So I talk about, what all of that means. We also have recommendations in here about improving equity overall in certain aspects of the college and career readiness process, looking at how they are using career counseling, looking at how we assess high quality instructional material, specifically making sure that our definition of high quality instructional material also means that they are culturally responsive, and recognizing that if we ignore culture, then it can't be high quality. We don't want colorblind high quality. We also talk about data disaggregation and the potential of that, but also the considerations, making sure that we aren't biased in our approach to that. And we also have some recommendations in terms of partnering with a variety of different institutions. So a lot of this are things that we know that do have potential, but things that we think that if we attune to certain factors, we could realize the potential of some of these measures. And we talked about the college and career aligned instructional materials. Again, noting that there's a deeper look at this right now, at the standards. Then pillar 4, more resources for students to be successful. Have a whole lot of green here because this is the pillar that really deals with students who have not been given the type of attention that they've deserved historically. And so these are Maryland's attempts to really make sure that we're looking at English learners, looking at students with disabilities, looking at students of various racial ethnic groups, and making sure that all students are included in this blueprint. And so we have some considerations in terms of how we look at certain aspects of this. One of the recommendations that we have is to make sure that when we look at things like the behavioral health supports, make sure that they're culturally competent behavioral health supports, and make sure to address any disparities in who has access to the support and who doesn't have access to the support. We also have some considerations with chronic absenteeism, because one of the things that we've found is that when students are chronically absent, there's a narrative that prevails, and that narrative is usually around the student being disengaged or not wanting to come to school because they don't like school, they're not motivated for school, or because of delinquent behavior. But really looking, closely and carefully at it, sometimes it's because of health, sometimes it's because they are being pushed out. Sometimes they're being suspended so much for things like dress code violations and some nervous behaviors that they might have, maybe chewing gum, using cell phones, different things like that. And so they're being suspended so much that they stop coming to school because they know that they're going to be put out, or the school is giving them the message that school isn't so important because we're telling you can't come because you came to school late. So wanted to make sure that all of those issues are considered when we talked about absenteeism. Mostly with Pillar 5, we considered them to be pretty neutral. We did have some considerations that we wanted to be observed in terms of the expert teams, and that's to just really make sure that the expert teams represent the diversity of the districts that they're evaluating. And so it's about 231. So I think this gives you a good overview of how we approach the report and some of our major findings and takeaways. So I can open it up to a larger conversation at this point.
Thank you. I know it's difficult for people to ask questions on a document that you don't have in front of you, but what we're looking for are sort of questions on the themes that he discussed.
And I also want to give an opportunity to Dr. McClendon if you think that I covered everything, or if there's something you want to add.
I'll wait to add further questions, but I think you did a good job.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Gilda?
So, yes, I agree. I think you did a wonderful job sharing the overview. I was curious if you could share a little bit more about the National Board Certification, because I know that was something that was talked a lot about.
Yeah. So there's two issues at play. One, the National Board Certification, and a lot of the research that I looked at, could be modernized. I was trying to find more up-to-date research, but the research that I looked at showed that there's a demographic mismatch of the nationally board certified teachers and the teacher workforce in general. And there's already a demographic mismatch of the teacher workforce and the student population. So that means that if we only looked at teachers who are currently nationally board certified, they'd be less diverse, not more diverse, than the general teacher workforce. So having the objective of having more of them at the low performing schools. And I also have a recommendation not to call it low performing, to call it high priority, but I understand that that's in the legislation. But I'm leaving that as a recommendation. So if we have a recommendation to have more nationally board certified teachers at high priority schools in its current form, that could mean to making that workforce less diverse as opposed to more diverse. So the objective has to be diversifying the number of nationally board certified teachers, not just getting them into these schools. That's number one. Number two, and I did try to look at evidence on both sides, but right now, there's no compelling evidence that national board certification measures the qualities or characteristics that is important for schools that have less resources or who have a student population who may need more support for any number of reasons. So that just needs to be looked at a little bit more closely, and making sure that if nationally board certified teachers or if we're looking at teachers that need to go to high priority schools, are there other things in addition to or instead of national board certification that might better capture what these schools need in terms of teachers who understand the environment that they're teaching in, teachers who are very competent and proficient in teaching across culture, teachers who have the type of flexibility and emotional acuity to be able to understand and intervene in very complex situations that may or may not be adequately captured in national board certification. Also understand that national board certification, it's the national body of it, does have diverse leadership right now. They do have a diversity committee, and there are going to be efforts to have them talk to us about some of these concerns that I've raised in this report.
Thank you.
Other questions? Queen?
Yes, thank you again for this. This is super helpful. You talked about with the KRA, the need for, I think, like more robust training, and I'm not super familiar with the particulars around administering the KRA, but can you talk more about just like the need and how that could be done? And then like some alternatives to the KRA, right? Like we know it's just a snapshot. We know it's taken at the beginning of the school year, right? So it really doesn't show students like in their progression and their performance by the end of kindergarten. But if you could just shed some light on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so developmentally, children's most rapid period of brain development is between the ages of 1 and 5, or not 1 and 5, 0 and 5. That's why we see vast variations in their abilities at different ages. And we also see pretty rapid changes in their ability, even within a year. You may have a student who isn't talking very well 1 month, and a few months later, they may have made some rapid gains. So measuring their ability to be ready for a kindergarten is not an easy thing to do. And I think that, and this is my opinion, I would consider it somewhat of an expert opinion, but that could be argued. I mean, there's certainly people who are more invested in the kindergarten reading assessment than I am. But it is my opinion that the focus of KRA is very narrow, and it tries to achieve something that perhaps may not even be possible to achieve. And that's put a score on whether or not a child is ready for kindergarten, whatever that means. So the only thing I can say is that it needs to be used with extreme caution. Now, I've looked at kindergarten readiness scores across the nation. The scores typically have about half of the students ready for kindergarten. That's when I look at them, being used in different districts. About half of the students are ready for kindergarten. That seems statistically improbable to me, that 50% of them would not be ready for kindergarten, and then they get into kindergarten, and in terms of good studies that show how they're doing by their first grade year and how they scored on the kindergarten readiness assessment, I haven't seen that. I also see racial differences every time I've looked at it. And knowing that the teacher workforce is mostly white, and by that, we can make a safe assumption that you're going to have more white raters than raters of color. And if they are rating children whose behavior they may not understand the biases associated with how they're rating these students. And for me, the most compelling evidence that there are racial biases in rating is that most of the time when I look at it, Asian students are scoring lower than white students, even in districts where later measures show Asian students outperforming white students. So, it seems improbable that so many fewer of them would be ready compared to white students for kindergarten. And that would mean something if it's not showing up later. So those are the reasons why I think that it should be done with extreme caution. We've had these conversations, and I think that led to the recommendation that there should be training for teachers. But what I didn't see was training specifically on bias, implicit bias, cultural competence. So that's what I'm recommending, that the training not be limited to the technical aspects of administering it, but it really be looking at how your biases may influence how your observations. And also, there needs to be training on how to understand it responsibly, going back to the classical test theory, and them understanding that there's error in every score. You shouldn't assign the score to a person and overinterpret what that might mean. And I see Natasha.
Councilman McLennan?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I have administered the KRA and done community engaged research around the interpretation of the results. And I would agree, not an expert opinion though, I won't argue that, but I would say I have seen conversations in communities around how different students of color are subjected to the bias in the rating, certain behaviors around them not paying attention or not being still while going through parts of the assessment are then attributed to their lack of readiness for kindergarten, when it's really a different socialization process that they've experienced up until the point of being in formal education spaces. And so it has no implication for their success in the classroom beyond being socialized to be in a classroom. Especially when we've seen for Asian students, if there is no one there that is Asian American, Asian reflective of their identity, sometimes they're just uncomfortable. And so they respond in kind, and then they are rated as being less ready. And so I think when we made those recommendations around training, especially around rater bias, it's some of those things are what I had in mind of how can we make sure that people are rating it with cultural competence and also have a better understanding of different modes of socialization that in educative processes and experiences that students have before they enter into a formalized classroom setting. Super helpful. Thank you both.
Shamoya?
It's a little less a question because I'm already in so much agreement with what has been presented here. But I do think the conversation we're having at this moment is a great reminder that there is a legal requirement that the kindergarten readiness assessment itself be evaluated for cultural and racial bias. And I don't know yet that we've seen the results of that evaluation.
Rachel?
I was just gonna say, I recall, I believe Chandra said that that report was in the final stages and that we would be receiving it soon. I don't know that Chandra is on, but we could follow up.
I don't know, Matt, if you have any information about it?
I can check on that.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Okay, well, if there are none, I just want to say how much I appreciate working with you all. And I know that this report was the final stage of the current contract that we have. But we're certainly going to discuss what type of involvement I'll continue to have, even if it's informal. But I really believe in what the state of Maryland is doing, and just grateful that you all thought enough of me to bring me into this process and to take our recommendations, Dr. McClendon and mine, under advisement.
If you're good enough for the White House, you're good enough for. Thank you so much for working with us. If I could get Emma, could you pop on and just explain what the next steps are with this document for
Yeah,
how you want the
absolutely.
work group to engage with it?
Yes, so we will be sending out the document to the work group, so you all can access it as well following today's meeting. So it will be shared with members of the work group.
And then, but just in terms of after they read it, how do we want them to engage with that content and going forward with our
Okay,
deliberations?
I understand. Okay, thank you. So if you continue to have questions that you'd like to bring up, and like we said, we're going to continue to talk with Dr. Tolson about engagement in the work moving forward. But you're more than welcome to send those questions directly to me, and I can pass them on or try to answer them, and we can figure out a way that they can get answered is basically what I would like to share. So if you have any reflections or questions after the meeting, we'll figure out a way to make that happen. And if I can provide any further detail next time that we meet about that process or even in between, I will get those answers to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Tolson. Thank you, Dr. McClendon. You're welcome to stay on and listen, or if you have to run and do very important things, you can do that too, which I know you do.
Thank you. Thank you both.
All right. So next up, I think we were sort of going to go back in time, if I'm correct, Emma.
Yes.
And, just remind everybody what we actually accomplished, which was a lot. Thank you all. So in phase one, which started last February, we had our 10 public work group meetings from February through July. We identified both output and outcome measures across all the 5 blueprint pillars. And at the blueprint level, we looked at outcome measures. And just as a reminder, there's 2 different types of measures we're talking about. Output measures are those that are indicators of the implementation and delivery of the strategies. And then outcome measures are indicators of the results and benefits of the blueprint strategies for students in schools. And Dr. Toldson actually had put this in his report, these definitions in his report, and we stole them because they were so well worded. The work group, we identified qualitative and quantitative data that were also going to be collected, and just data to track, not necessarily to set targets on, but data to track. And the blueprint law established implementation targets for specific measures. So not only were they the measures that we talked about, but there's also some that are part of the blueprint law. So that's the recap. We only had one page of recap, didn't we, Emma? Okay. So in terms of update, the work group, we shared the recommended output and outcome measures for the AIB for their approval in July 2023. The AIB, the board, along with the staff, made some changes to the recommended measures and had some additional measures to set targets for pillars 2, 3, and 4. And Emma, feel free to chime in if there's something more that you wanted to discuss on any of these.
So I could just quickly share. I actually took the slides from those meetings and just added them here. So really what you'll see is just, I don't think that none of the measures were taken out, just to be clear, that were recommended to the board. There were some revisions and then additions. And I think that the revisions were just trying to make things a little bit more targeted based on concerns that were considerations that the board members brought up during that, that adoption meeting and review meeting. So I'll just go through these quickly without reading them and try to summarize them. You see them on the screen. Again, these are taken from, I think it was the July 20th meeting slide deck. But one of these is we added an output measure on the number of hours on average that teachers participate in PD. And as you'll see that there's also a disaggregation by type of professional development and the focus of the professional development. And then we also revised the original measure focused on retention of teachers to account for teachers who may be moving up in the career ladder, but are still spending some time in the classroom or a portion of their day in the classroom.
Hey, Emma,
Yes.
I'm noticing a lot of heads like getting closer to the screen. So I'm thinking that people actually wanted to hear more about these. So I think you could read each one.
Okay, absolutely. I'll try to separate them out a little bit more next time.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't have tried to pack so many of these onto the screen. Yes, so I will read these out. So the first output measure is number of hours on average teachers participate in professional development. So this was an addition, and we are clarifying, although with the outcome measures report and everything that we've done, we've clarified that all of the measures will be disaggregated, all of the data. But we're just clarifying here further, because this is a little bit of a different measure, that it will be disaggregated by LEA, school, and teacher demographics, as well as the type of training, which is not going to be the same for all measures, because not all measures capture teacher training. But we just wanted to specify that it would be disaggregated by type of training, focused on cultural competency, culturally responsive teaching, individualized instruction, pedagogical knowledge, etc. So those are just some examples, to the extent possible that we can disaggregate by these things. Then we revised the outcome measure focused on retention of teachers slightly, to note that this is retention of teachers who are still teaching in the classroom a portion of their time in Maryland pre-K through 12 schools for 5 years or more. So this could account for teachers who may switch schools as well, or switch LEAs, but they're still teaching in the classroom in a Maryland public school. And it also accounts for if they are moving up the career ladder into different positions on the career ladder, but they are still in the teacher track of things. They haven't moved over to the administrator track. They're in the teacher track. And I think that there was also a provision for trying to determine if there's a way to measure or survey teachers who do move over to the admin track. I think we're exploring that as part of the update, but there's over 200 pages to the comprehensive plan, so I'm not going to say for sure that that was an update, but I will circle back on that.
I think we also just kind of tabled it because the career ladder hadn't really been fully defined yet. So
yeah, it's also a part of it. Okay, and then these other ones are not measures in the sense that we are setting targets for them. but we made some additions for data to track, which is percentage of teacher candidates from HBCUs and MSIs, meaning historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, as they are officially designated. Percentage of Maryland teachers who graduated from approved state teacher preparation programs. Percentage of Maryland teachers who graduate from out-of-state teacher preparation programs. And then feedback from IHEs, institutions of higher education, disaggregated by type of institution, school districts and teacher candidates on their experiences and needs related to teacher preparation and recruitment. The state should share these data and feedback with relevant stakeholders and policymakers to inform decision-making and planning. So this is one of these tricky ones where we actually will need to potentially create some new data collection methods and activities and instruments to actually get this feedback, but we'll see how that happens. And then for pillar 3, we have additional output measures. As a reminder, pillar 2 is focused on increasing the quality and diversity of improving the quality and diversity of Maryland teachers and leaders. Pillar 3 is focused on college and career readiness, which CTE systems play a big part of. So we have 3 output measures focused on the CTE committee.
Emma,
Yes.
before you move on to pillar 3, Shamoya had a question. Do we collect data on alternately certified teachers elsewhere? And Shamoya, when you say elsewhere, are you referring to out of state?
No, I just mean that I recognize some of the things on the slide were in addition or recognition of some data we would also need to collect. Have we already accounted for alt cert teachers somewhere else in our work on pillar 2?
I'd have to look.
Anne might remember.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if we have. Shamoya, can I circle back with you on that? I'm sure that I feel like we must have it somewhere, but if you wouldn't mind if I just circle back, I could probably look it up right after this meeting. There's just, as we're going to talk about, there's 92 measures. So I'm trying to remember which one is that.
Totally. We have time, definitely.
All right, thank you. I think it must be somewhere. Yeah, okay, we'll figure that out. And if it's not, then it might be because it's already being tracked in some way, and so we didn't feel a need to track it again, but we'll circle back. Okay, any other questions on pillar 2 before I move on to pillar 3? Okay. The output measures that we added for pillar 3, the number of pathways approved by the CTE committee, the number of apprenticeships approved by the CTE committee, and the number of occupational skill standards adopted or revised by the CTE committee. Having targets for all of these. And this corresponds with the duties of the CTE committee as outlined in the blueprint for things they need to identify. And corresponding with that or following up from that, one of the revised measures was the percentage of students earning in IRC or industry recognized credential approved by the CTE committee. And I think that was the addition of approved by the CTE committee and disaggregated by the type of industry recognized credential, as well as the industry under which it's earned, and whether or not it's also a high school apprenticeship among other student groups. So that was a unique disaggregation. So we wanted to call that out. But again, all the data will be disaggregated. And then finally, another type of data to track, and we will have to figure out how we're going to operationalize this one, but access to a well-rounded curriculum as mandated by COMAR, ensuring that we are tracking this. Any questions about pillar 3 additions and revisions that were adopted by the AIB?
I don't see any hands.
All right, great. Finally, we go on to pillar 4, where we didn't have any additional measures, but additions for data to track, specifically really focused on, well, actually, so it is somewhat of additions or revisions for the output and outcome measures, because we're adding a disaggregation to disaggregate specific existing outcome and output measures by students enrolled in and teachers working in community schools where appropriate. So this is we put this under pillar 4 as a revision, but really this applies across all the pillars. So wherever it's appropriate to disaggregate a measure, or wherever we can disaggregate a measure by students enrolled in a community school or teachers working in a community school, we will. So again, it depends on the ability to do this, but we will do that across all measures or across measures in all pillars. And then in terms of data to track, the number of families and neighbors who volunteer at community schools, family reports of feeling confident in and supporting their children's learning in community schools, family reports of feeling welcome, valued, and connected to the community school, and the diversity of voices and groups documented in the needs assessment conducted by the community school coordinator. These are all really, I think, significant indicators of progress in implementing community schools, and based off of research around best practices with community schools. I wouldn't say that this is completely comprehensive, though. You know, there are definitely different ways to measure community school effectiveness, but these are some good ways or things that we should be looking at, and are, you know, at this point, difficult to set targets around specifically. So this is data to track right now. And we also will have to, I think, pretty assuredly have to create some new data collection methods and instruments to actually access this data. So we're going to get into that in a second because that's easier said than done. But I'll pause right here and see if anybody has any questions for the revisions to the Pillar 4 measures. Okay.
We'll see the hands.
Good. Okay. All right. So going off of these changes that happened in additions in July. So we all met for our last meeting as a work group on July 7th. The AIB adopted the updated Blueprint Comprehensive Plan, which includes these measures on August 1st. And AIB also, before that, actually, I think it was the July 20th meeting, approved a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, with Maryland Longitudinal Data Systems Center staff to provide research, analysis, and consultation services to the AIB. And those services are in support of helping to develop the targets that we need to set for the output and outcome measures. AIB and MLDSC staff, since then, we've been working with other state agencies and partners to identify data sources and owners for each of these measures and data to track. Sounds really simple, but here's the rub. We have 92 total measures, and we need to identify the data sources for all of these measures if they have them. We have actually 20 output measures and 22 outcome measures. So in all, we're setting targets for 42 measures when you think about it, out of those 92. So it seems a little less scary, but still quite a bit of work for 42 measures that we have to set targets for. And then we have 32 pieces of 32 separate pieces of data, or it's not measures, it's data to track. So that's just what we're going to call it. And then I also wanted to identify the 18 measures, which actually kind of overlapped with what some of the output and outcome measures that the work group identified. But some of those measures already have targets that need to be met embedded within the blueprint law. For instance, 4-year-olds who served by the ability for them to be enrolled in what 100% of 4-year-olds should be enrolled in pre-K programs by fiscal year 26. I think I have that one right. That's in the law. So that's a target in and of itself. So we wanted to raise those ones up as legislative requirements where there is already an embedded target. And then there are 42 other ones, though, where there is no embedded target in the blueprint law, and which we will be setting targets for. And then of those 92, so I'm breaking it down a little bit further here. So between the output, outcome, data to track, and legislative requirements, that all adds up to 92. And then we also, of those 92 measures, we have 57 currently where we feel like we have a really good idea of what the data sources are. So more than half, which is good. And then we have 21 measures where we know there is no current data source for this, and we will need to implement or in some cases also develop some new data collection methods and activities to actually get data to set targets for these measures. And then there are 14 measures where we are uncertain if there is currently data for those measures. We still have some questions about that. In some cases, I think we are somewhat sure, but we want to be 100% sure. And then others, we truly have no idea. So we're calling those as measures to be determined right now. We just don't know if we have data for those or who the data source would be. So that's a summary. There's a huge spreadsheet with all this information. Didn't want to overwhelm you guys with that today. So we tried to summarize it as much as possible.
Emma, of
Yeah.
those 42, what are the breakdowns of measures with data sources, measures without data sources, etc.? And you might not have that right now.
I don't have that right now, but that is a very good question. Yeah, and I can get that for the next meeting. Yeah. Need to do some more countive functions in that spreadsheet, but I can make sure that happens. All right, did we have any other questions in the chat? All right, thank you, Shmoya. Okay, so going off of that, we want to talk about what this means looking forward. So I've tried to kind of separate the next steps into two different categories of what we have to be doing here. One that's focused on data collection and the other on setting targets. These are not in any particular order, and trying to really categorize these things into two separate objectives, or focus areas. But we're going to have to do some of these concurrently if we want to get work done. So that's why there's no particular order for these. As of right now, we're going to continue to identify data sources and owners for all of these measures, for the 14 measures in particular, where we aren't sure where those data sources are. And then at the same time, for the measures where we do know, okay, this is who the data source is, or this is what the data source is, I should say. We will work with state agencies and partners to access the corresponding data for each measure. And then we will, at the same time, and this might, well, I say at the same time, this might take a little while to get this implemented, because ultimately it has to be based in best-in-class research and evidence-based. We need to be thinking about what the necessary instruments or data collection processes are for the measures with no existing data. So that process needs to be developed as well. And if we try to do all these things in an order without starting something else first and not doing these things concurrently, it could take a long time. So we have to be thinking about this strategically. Then as far as actually setting the targets, we are working to identify the priority measures for setting targets. We have 42 for which we need to set targets, and we want to think about this. This is going to take a considerable amount of time to set targets for all of those. So we need to really be strategic about which ones we need to be setting progress for first. Which ones are like the leading indicators of progress for which we need to know, is this working? Is the blueprint being implemented as envisioned? Are we seeing progress here? We're also working on establishing a target setting framework that we will be using as much as possible to help set these targets for each measure, and that we could apply to each measure for setting targets. And we're working with MLDS staff to develop that framework. And then finally, we are going to identify recommended targets for each measure for the AIB's review and approval. That's the ultimate goal. Joe, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is maybe a question for the larger group, but I'm wondering now, these measures without data sources, if at some point it makes sense to re-examine those and make a determination if like the juice is worth the squeeze. Like if this is a critical data point that it's essential to go through and identify and develop new data sources, or when we were looking at this kind of in a vacuum, like more aspirationally, this would be a great measure to track. But now that we start evaluating all of the time, energy, and effort that it would be in order to collect the data, in order to to track this, that maybe this is something that we feel like is no longer something that we should prioritize.
I think Joe asked that of the group. I heard him say, maybe this is a question for the group. So, hey, group.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, and maybe Emma, if you want to chime in, like, and give kind of your initial, okay, or we could.
Oh, no.
Gilda's ready. Gilda's ready.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I totally understand where you're coming from, you know, considering we have the 42 already plus, and then we're going to add to it. So I think it makes sense to carefully look at those and maybe reevaluate. I agree.
I am on the other end of things. Just want to briefly say that I think we're on the frontier of some data collection here, and what we create and find through this process can yield a lot of dividends in the future. And so I think it is worth doing. Emily?
I was just going to say, as one of the agencies that might be responsible for a new collection or two, I would welcome that opportunity to have some open discussions about possibilities, what that would look like. And some of it may not be actual new collections. It may be revising existing collections, changing our data definitions. So there may be ways that we can do this that are easily attainable and not these heavy lifts that we might be imagining. So I absolutely welcome the opportunity to have further discussion about that.
Emma, did you want to open it up to just broader discussions?
Yes, because the next slide is next steps, honestly. So if we have broader questions or comments, I will say in regards to Joe's comment about revisiting measures, it sounds like we have a couple of different opinions were voiced, regardless of which direction we go in. If we do, this is going to take time to develop those methods and instruments. So I'm thinking potentially in some cases years. So we just have to be cognizant of that as we approach this work. So regardless again of which direction we go in, that's important.
Maybe it would be helpful to have the list of the 42 measures and what bucket they fall into in terms of data availability. Just to share that along with whatever other documents you share with the folks after this meeting.
Okay. Yep.
And Shamoya gave me a thumbs up. Thank you.
I think that there was discussion around sharing that in advance, but it's such an immense list that we really wanted to provide this overview with you all today without it feeling overwhelming. So if you could just give me some time to think about how we can organize that in an efficient way. I was actually just meeting with some folks today to talk about that. So happy to do it. I would like it to be shared in the most efficient and understandable way as possible while giving you guys the information that you need. So I just wanted to share that.
That is completely reasonable.
Makes
Do
sense.
not work over the weekend.
Oh, okay.
I don't know about that.
About to say.
Why don't you share next steps, Emma, and that will probably get people thinking about questions.
Sounds good. Okay. So for next steps, well, first of all, I have to say I'm so pleased to be working with you all again. It's been a long few months, so excited to have everyone working together again. So I'm just trying to outline some broad things here of where we're continuing to go. We talked a little bit about the next steps with you. Looking forward, what we're trying to do in the immediate term right now. We are working on continuing to identify and access data sources and compile data. So that's going to involve a lot more work with other state agencies and staff who sit on the ex officio team, who are all here today as well. Many of them are here today as well. In order to, get this data and to identify the trend data that we need and everything that we need to set targets, that's a lot more, I would say, behind the scenes work of doing that. So there's going to be engagement or continued engagement really with the ex officio team. So this is just to say that for right now, I think there's not necessarily going to be a lot of homework for the wider work group as we had in the past of looking at the measures, thinking about ways to potentially revise them. That could still happen, and we might come to you with questions or things to consider in between meetings. I'm not saying that that won't happen, but between now and the next meeting, as of right now, we have no homework for you all. So that's probably welcome news for a lot of you, and because you're already setting aside so much of your time, and we appreciate your engagement with this. We are also continuing to research and draft a target setting framework for the work group's review and input. And I think that we will probably just, as of right now, we would share this at the next meeting in November. I think are 90% sure that we're setting a meeting date of the third week of November, but we're still looking at a couple possibilities. So I just want to make sure that we have that in place before we send out the calendar invite to all of you. So we'll get that out as soon as we can. And then during that meeting, we would like to present this framework for your review and input. And that would be, the major next steps for our work. Does anybody have any questions about that?
When you're talking about a framework, can you give the folks some idea of kind of the things that you're thinking about? Like what would make up a framework?
So we're thinking about, and Angie and Bess, if you want to chime in at all, or if there's anything, I think I got it, but so no pressure, but if there's something that I'm missing as I'm explaining this, please step in. But we're thinking about questions or considerations that can be broadly applied to the measures that we need to set targets for. So this is the process that we will follow in setting measures for, or setting targets for each measure. Here's the first question that we're going to start with. We'll be thinking about maybe assumptions about are we making any assumptions about the measure, or what progress is going to look like? Are we thinking that, we might see a potential slowing down or increase in the initial years, like those types of things, those considerations. Like if you're seeing more supports for students, you might see an increase in the number of students who need supports initially, and then over time you see fewer and fewer students needing supports, those types of things. And then, from there, it's really thinking about, are there other questions, are there other considerations that should be applied for each set of data? Are we thinking about closing a potential gap? Are we thinking about achievement writ large and just setting a set number for student proficiency? Or are we thinking about, like, how are we approaching each measure, and could it potentially be approached differently? So we want to be identifying what those questions we're asking should be for each measure, to ensure that we're following a robust process, and that we're, also thinking about it, I don't want to say objectively, but we're just asking the same questions that need to be asked for each measure, and making sure we're applying the same level of thought and consideration to each one. Does that make sense?
Angie provided a definition in the chat. Angie, do you want to expand on your definition in any way?
I think Emma expanded on it quite well. I created a definition off of the top of my head, so please do not hold me to this definition. But off the top of my head, I think the framework will set sort of a decision tree process whereby different methods are selected or used for decision-making by the AIB to set a target depending on the data available legislative requirements or mandates, the literature or effect sizes available in the literature, etc.
I think you said
that's a
that a
good-
lot more concisely.
Yeah, that's a good definition off the top of your head.
Yeah, very good.
Way to put me on the spot, but thank
I
you.
know. I'm sorry, Angie. Sorry about that.
Are there any thoughts that people have just about how we've laid this out or how Emma has laid this out? Basically, no homework tonight. But a few weeks from now, 3 or so weeks from now, we'll have another meeting where that framework is presented. If there's any follow-up after you read the report from Dr. Tolson's and Drs. Tolson and London, we can discuss that. We can discuss the question that Joe raised about the 42 that don't have any of that, sorry, not 42, any of the 42 at least that don't have measures currently. Queen?
Yes, just quickly thinking about Joe's question and then this process, and thank you all for explaining it. Do you all envision a timeline? I know Emma said like certain pieces, which is true, right? When you're doing this kind of work can take a long time. I'm going to put it that way. But just for us in this work, how we might be thinking about it.
Queen, you said a timeline for the target setting process or just overall?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. I think that as we continue to get more information and access data and see how long this process takes to do all these different pieces, because as you said, there's so much involved in this. We're moving as quickly as we can, is really the answer to the question. We don't have a set timeline for that right now, but we're moving as quickly as we can and pushing things forward. And as we have updates about what that timeline could look like, we promise to share them, and we'll share more information as we can get about when they could be set. It's a very good question though, so thank you. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I just got an update in the chat, and so I feel pretty comfortable saying that we're looking at November 21st, Tuesday, November 21st, going back to Tuesdays as we previously did, for the next meeting date starting at 3 p.m. And then hopefully our new student member will be able to join us as well. So school will be out and ready to join for the school day. Yeah, that's what we'll send a calendar invitation following this meeting for the next meeting. All right. With that, I think that we're actually going to end early today, which is a new thing for us. We often are up to the very last minute, so it's great. We appreciate all of you though. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emma and Rachel and other AIB staff and the MLDS staff who have been working with them and all the ex officios who've been working. It's great teamwork. And this is moving forward. It may not be as fast as some people want, but we're making progress. So it's great.
Thank you all.
Thank you. And look out for an email from Emma.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.